Good afternoon. I'm Charles Shapiro, President of the World Affairs Council. Today's program is a flash briefing on Lebanon. We do a flash briefing. We throw it together quickly when there's a crisis in the world and people have got questions and they're trying to figure out what in the world is going on. And that's why we selected Lebanon. We're trying something new today. It's a joint program with the Carter Center. We have two Carter Center experts, Hrair Balian and Rana Shabb. Welcome. I want to give a special welcome to a number of Carter Center friends and colleagues, including Paige Alexander, the CEO of the Carter Center, who's also a member of the World Affairs Council Board of Directors, and John Hardiman, former CEO of the Carter Center. I want to give shout outs to a number of old friends, including Gail Evans, Sumaya Khalifa, John Huneman, and Vincent Liu, who many of you know is the former Director General of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Atlanta. I've just got some quick background on Lebanon, which was news to me, and I think it might be news to you, just so you can keep this in mind. Lebanon geographically is 1/3 the size of the state of Maryland. Its population is around 5 million, with a gigantic Lebanese diaspora of between 5 and 15 million people, the largest number of whom live in Brazil, followed by Argentina, Colombia, the US, and Venezuela. Approximately 1/3 of Lebanese are Christian, 1/3 are Sunni Muslims, 1/3 are Shia Muslims. Lebanese GDP is $53 billion, or it was in 2019, and GDP per capita is around $11,500. To the audience, in about 30 minutes, we'll take questions from you. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you don't know where it is, see where it says more, click on more, and one of the things that shows up is Q&A. And so you click that, and that's where you type in your question. Please use Q&A, not chat, because it's easier for me to read. Keep your questions short. And use your name. I won't ask any of the questions that are submitted anonymously. Rana Shabb is Associate Director for the Middle East and the Conflict Resolution Program at the Carter Center. She's worked in Washington on U.S. police policy. Rana earned a BA in Quantitative Economics and International Relations from Tufts, a Master of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown, and received her PhD at Georgia Tech, where she was a Sam Nunn Security Fellow. Hrair Balian joined the Carter Center in 2008 as Director of the Conflict Resolution Program, transitioning in April to the role of Senior Advisor. Hrair has worked in the Balkans, Eastern Europe, the former Soviet states, the Middle East, and Africa. He was raised in Lebanon, coming to the US for higher education, receiving a law degree from Golden Gate University in San Francisco. In 2009, the New England College awarded him an honorary Doctor of Laws for his lifetime commitment to the dignity, respect, and self-determination of all peoples, and for his uncompromising effort to resolve international conflict. So, Rana and Hrair, welcome to you both. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Lebanon had a devastating civil war from 1975 to 1990. I'm going to start with Rana. Rana, is this simply what's going on now in mid-October? Is this simply a continuation of the earlier Lebanese civil war after a 30-year pause?
Thank you, Charles, for your question. So it's interesting because it could be yes or no. So the Civil War ended in 1990, and there's been relative, and I underscore relative, peace, since then. But skirmishes like we've seen earlier this month are not unheard of in this period. And so what I do want to underscore is what ended the Civil War was a power sharing agreement that sort of froze the dynamic in time between mainly at the time Sunnis and Christians in what was a 6-to-5 ratio in parliament, 6 Christians, 5 Muslims in parliament at the end of the Civil War in 1990. the Sunnis were perceived to emerge as the winners, and that ratio was changed to half-half between Christians and Muslims. And since then, that power sharing agreement has persisted in sort of, I would say, a dysfunctional way in preserving minority rights. And so what we see today are several underlying tensions that are poking at that supposed power sharing agreement that was supposed to bring stability. One is severe macroeconomic instability. So over half the population now is over the poverty line, massive devaluation of the currency, instability, etc. And then you have armed groups within the country across the board who resort to those arms to settle disputes. So that's another issue. And another issue is the emergence of a burgeoning civil society organization around October 2019, requesting an overhaul of this power sharing system that has proven to, if you will, enable corruption at unprecedented scales. And so there's many issues going on related to those. We've seen several skirmishes, but in order for us to call this a civil war, I don't think we're there yet. And there's obviously one group, which is Hezbollah, which is pretty heavily armed in comparison to the rest. And there's no obvious counterparty to that civil war at this point, besides these underlying tensions that I've outlined.
It sounds amazingly complicated, which I guess is why people haven't been able to resolve it. I mean, why does power sharing, you would assume, looking from the outside, that power sharing was set up in order to avoid these skirmishes, that it would have a way to channel people's energy into politics as opposed to into the street. I mean, why has the power sharing on the 50-50 ratio that Rana described, why has it not worked? And Hrair looks frozen. So, oh, here he is. Okay.
No.
He's thinking. He was not frozen. He's thinking. Right? We don't allow that here.
No. I was wondering who you are asking the question to, so I didn't want to.
I'm sorry. To you.
To me. Okay. Why hasn't the power sharing agreement worked? Because one, the power sharing agreement has been used to create a situation in the country whereby each community's politicians have used the country's economy as a milking cow for their own personal and community benefit. So the corruption in the country has taken an enormous dimension as a result of this power sharing, or I call it more a sectarian political division of the country. It hasn't worked because they have not solved the root causes of the civil war to begin with, as Rana described already. I don't want to repeat that. And those root causes still exist today in various forms of inequality among the Lebanese politicians. Another reason why it hasn't worked is because of exterior interventions in the country. Each political party, each sect, and within it, each political party has its own sponsors from the outside world, whether it's Iran, whether it's Israel, whether it's Turkey today, whether it's Syria, was Syria in the past, and Syria is coming back again to influence Lebanese politics. They each have fought their differences outside of Lebanon within Lebanon by by sponsoring the political parties, by arming the militias of the political parties, and eventually by fighting their own wars in Lebanon, as they're doing next door in Syria as well today.
Hrair, let me follow up on that. I mean, it's hard for us to understand that political parties have militias. I mean, so they're not, people aren't just competing at the ballot box. People are actually competing with weapons in the streets. Am I right? I mean, how does the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, I mean, God forbid, I mean, how does a party get a militia? How does that happen?
Yeah, look, whenever you mix politics and guns in private hands, that never ends up well, regardless of which country where we're talking about. In Lebanon, in the 50s, when there was a civil war, 58, the communities, their parties, their chieftains fought their differences on the streets with their militias participating in the fight. In the civil war of 75 to 1990, the same thing happens. Before then, when I was still in Lebanon in the 60s, I could see, late 60s, I could see political parties arming themselves up to their eyeballs, really. And whenever a state loses the monopoly of using force, using weapons in the country, and I'm not talking about hunting weapons, I'm talking about war weapons, then the fate of that country is sealed in terms of war, of those weapons being used in a war. Now, for a while after the 75-90 civil war, the parties, most of the parties gave up their weapons, turned in their weapons to the state. At least that's what was said, and that's what was believed, with the exception of Hezbollah. There was an exception for Hezbollah. And
so in the agreement, there was an exception for Hezbollah?
Understanding. There was an understanding that Hezbollah had a special role in Lebanon, and its weapons were not taken.
Wow.
So for a while, most parties, if not all, respected this arrangement that they would not arm themselves. But soon, say in the last 10 or 15 years, they started arming themselves again. And in particular, in the last 3-4 years, there's evidence that the political parties were again heavily arming themselves. Of course, Hezbollah has the largest cache of weapons, kept it and continues to have, and highly trained, as they claim, about 100,000 highly claimed militia members throughout the country.
Rana, you mentioned corruption. Can you talk a little bit more about corruption? I mean, corruption is not unknown in other countries, including our own. Is Lebanese corruption worse than in Syria or in Turkey or in Mexico? I mean,
in some places, yeah, thank you for your question. In some places, you know, corruption in a very moderate way is viewed as a cost of doing business. And then, you know, it's a spectrum from cost of doing business to a factor that's debilitating. And so Lebanon scores, I think there's 180 countries around the world. Lebanon ranks 150 in terms of the most corrupt. So there's only 30 more corrupt places in the world than Lebanon. And so I want to go back again to the power sharing agreement and the problem that it's truly endemic. And so this is where the tension is, the power of an individual versus the power of a system. And so, for example, the Free Patriotic Movement of Michel Aoun, who's currently the president, ran for elections a while back on the platform to end corruption. And it was extremely popular. They are voted into power, form an alliance with Hezbollah, and once they entered the governing structures, became, you know, part of it and became part of they came in as a relatively clean political party, and now they are no longer viewed as such. And the problem is, like Hrair said, the economy is viewed as a milking cow for your sectarian allegiances. So whoever enters the system of governance, every decision is vetted by the head of the Sunnis, the head of the Shia, the head of the Christian. You called the Troika, the president, the prime minister, and the speaker of the house. And so that's how decisions are made to make sure that every sect is cashing in on whatever decision is being made. And this is the interesting thing, that when elections come around, they run against each other. Yet, if you look at the business landscape, they're in cahoots on a lot of things. Again, this being the incentive of making money, and then distributing it to your constituencies, again, in an inefficient way. And this is where we have a huge bloated public sector, which, if we touch on it, it is part of the macroeconomic instability and problem of the country, is that the fiscal spending of the government, you cannot keep up with it, because their incentive is to just spend on their constituents and themselves in the most inefficient way, and with lack of systems of transparency and regulatory agencies. So it's very difficult here. Like a president came in on the platform to end corruption, and then 10 years later, they're deeply embedded, and it's very hard to escape, even if you come in with good intentions.
Let me ask, the president is designated and must be a Christian, and the prime minister must be
Sunni,
and the speaker of the parliament must be a Shia, by agreement or by law?
It's called the gentleman's agreement.
It's called the gentleman's agreement, and that the division is across the board, not only government. So like you said, the president is always a Maronite Christian. The prime minister is always a Sunni. The speaker of the house is always Shia. And then the cabinet of ministers also has its own allocations. And then even associations, for example, the Association of Banks for Lebanon is also half-half, half Christian, half Muslim. So it's intrinsic to all thinking at all levels.
It's more problematic than that, Charles. It's not only, the division is not only done by, ministers, etc., but it goes down all the way down to the lowest levels of the civil servants. Each politician, each community, each politician, each political party are allocated a certain number of civil servants that they can hire, but hire on paper in many cases. Hire on paper. Thousands of civil servants are paid salaries who never show up to work, or they show up a few hours, have a few coffees and cigarette, and then they go home.
Oh, I like that job. So Hrair, with this latest crisis, the world suffered a recession because of the pandemic, because of COVID. Mm. And Rana talked about the fiscal crisis. Did the fiscal crisis cause the political crisis, or vice versa? How did that work out?
Gosh, fiscal crisis caused the economic. How would you answer that, Rana?
He's giving you the hard question.
Well, I think, I don't know, like who shot who at the Copacabana, the chicken or the egg, in terms of the economy, or is it the political situation? And they're linked, but you have to start somewhere in the story. And I think that the story starts with a burgeoning economic crisis in October of 2019. That's already 2 years ago. And so in the lead up to 2019, the Lebanese government relied massively on its diaspora sending money back home. The diaspora is a Lebanese population living abroad, which used to send by the order of $7 billion of remittances into the Lebanese economy. And that was a major help to the central bank, the Lebanese central bank, which helped shore up the Lebanese currency, etc. And because of world events, tightening of economies in the Gulf, where a lot of Lebanese tend to work, that number starts declining as we creep into 2019. And by October 2019, we're down to $3 billion of remittances. And this problem first starts to show its head when you have Lebanese traders going to the commercial banks requesting dollars, hard currency, in order to import wheat, medicine, etc. And they're getting pushback from the central bank that we don't have dollars. I'm sorry. And so this triggers a devaluation in the Lebanese currency for the first time since the Civil War. And so there starts to be a panic and a run on the banks. Also, in this scenario with a fiscal crisis, the Lebanese government suggests taxes on fuel, the WhatsApp app, on voice calls, which a lot of the Lebanese use. And so this triggers massive anger in the street. You know, you no longer have access to your money in Lebanese banks because of informal credit control, because of informal capital control. And there's a suggested increased taxes when you don't even have access to your money. And then finally, I think the drop that makes the glass overflow is a forest fires in October 2019, whereby Lebanese aircraft helicopters that were purchased in order to fight forest fires are not able to fly because of lack of maintenance, corruption, etc.
Oh man.
So you have a natural disaster that the government cannot respond to, suggested increase in taxes and devaluation of the currency, no access to your money, and that triggers the street protests of 2019. Which then leads to this cycle of crackdown, more protests, etc. I'll end there.
To make things more complicated, Rana forgot to mention the Ponzi scheme ran by the central bank of the country in order to entice Lebanese to put more foreign currency money into the banking system. They started providing interest rates that were not sustainable, 10, 15, 18% interest rate that's not seen anywhere else in the world. Even diaspora, expat Lebanese were bringing their money to Lebanese banks because they could not see that kind of interest rate outside Lebanon, but that was not sustainable. And they sustained it only by enticing more people to come in and invest, more people to come in and invest and give out the interest. But at some point, it came to a point where the whole Ponzi scheme just collapsed. They couldn't sustain that sort of deposits and interest, and people lost life savings. Lots of Lebanese, a huge number of middle-class Lebanese lost their life savings in this collapse.
And it makes people angry.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know who should answer this question, but I'm going to ask one last question before we go to the audience. We've got loads of questions coming in from the audience. But when you look at news accounts, they tend to say the trigger was the explosion in the Beirut harbor of what it was, nitrate, fertilizer that was being stored in a warehouse and exploded and destroyed neighborhoods, killed 200 plus people, wounded 7,000. I mean, how does that play? How does that play into partisan communitarian politics? And I'm not sure who should answer. Rana, you want to take a stab at that first?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. So so what we were just discussing, the Ponzi scheme and all the financial crisis is towards at the end of 2019. And I think, 2020, like for all of us, was a miserable year, but particularly for the Lebanese on so many fronts. One, is this explosion that came out of nowhere to the surrounding residents who, like we said, lost their life savings, no longer have access to health, who are suffering from electricity shortage and outages. And this is just one massive thing on the top of many other things. And what it is, at least the way it's being presented, is it's a criminal mistake so far, right? It came as a result of neglect, etc. At least it's not being framed. It wasn't ill-intentioned, even though storing such amounts of flammable chemicals in the most densely populated area of a city is unacceptable. And I think the way this ties into it, at least as how it's playing out, is that there is an investigation into this said explosion. And I think the established political elite is wary of an independent judiciary that's going to open the files and call to questioning politicians, security officials that are obviously linked to the ruling political class. And so where this explosion, people want accountability, especially the families of the families who had family members who died, want accountability, and this is the tension in the street, is the demand for accountability, yet an established political elite that's wary of an independent judiciary that might come after them in the highly likely scenario that they are somehow directly or indirectly implicated in the explosion.
Wow, it's amazing. Okay. I'm trying to, I've got a piece of paper here and I'm trying to keep all this down. I'm drawing lines all over it, trying to figure it out. So gosh, this is extraordinary. Let me ask some questions. This is from Wally Yazbek and it's directed at Rana. He asked, why doesn't Lebanon abolish this divide and conquer system imposed, he says, by the French, the power sharing system, and just go for a straight democratic election regardless of religion, clan, or family affiliation?
So, this is, again, so there's a whole backing behind this question, which is the emergent civil society organizations that want to see an end to this. Yet, when push comes to shove, especially under current tense circumstances, a lot of people's identity still shifts to the clan sometimes. So there's this desire to progress, but also a real fear that if this power sharing system is abolished, what's going to happen to the Christians? What happens to my rights? And so I'm not saying, I'm just giving the two perspectives on this issue and why it's very difficult to change. But that doesn't mean that a proposed change to the power sharing system cannot find a better way at protecting minority rights. But for now, this is what people know and this is what people fall back on. And so even with the latest skirmishes, the Christians actually fell back on, some Christians fell back on the rhetoric that at least someone stood to defend us when Hezbollah and Amal, the Shia group, came in to protest the judge that was investigating the bombing. So very quickly, very ugly sectarian rhetoric emerges. And so I think that's the tension between trying to move and find a better system, yet when instincts kick in, they're pretty ugly.
So, but who's going to change is the question. Who's going to change the system? The parliament normally, right? But the parliament members are the product of the sectarian systems. Why should they undermine a system that allows them to use the state as a milking cow? Why?
So,
The
so the,
politicians
the, the,
go
the
in-
beneficiaries of corruption are not going to abolish corruption.
Exactly.
Okay, two background questions that we've gotten that are actually quite interesting and it will help us understand. So Guy Tesler asks, is this crisis only in Beirut or is it across the country?
It's the whole country.
The whole country.
It applies to the whole country. Yeah.
And then Firuz Israel, one of our members, asks if American University in Beirut is still operating, if it's still functioning.
Yes, but it's a sorry ghost of itself, really, because many of the academics have left. Many of the young people who are bearing the brunt of the economic problems, cannot find jobs, have left the country. Students are leaving the country. The university is it's not anymore what it used to be some decades ago.
And can I add to Hrair's
Yes,
point
of course.
that the American University of Beirut also has a very important medical center. It's again, like Hrair said, it's a shell of itself, losing all its educated staff at alarming rates, doctors, nurses leaving, and those behind scrambling to serve under the most difficult conditions with no access to medication and limited access to energy. And we know, a month ago, the American University of Beirut Medical Center, the hospital, on a Friday announced that they had diesel reserves to run their electricity until Monday. Monday, if those reserves were not renewed, that they had 40 patients in the intensive care unit that would die on life support. And this is an institution, right, that is prioritized in terms of its access to diesel. And even at that level, it's become extremely difficult to run an institution for humanitarian purposes.
Wow.
You cannot blame the people for leaving the university, because right before the crisis, before 2019, they were earning decent middle-class salaries, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, or the equivalent of $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month. With the currency devaluation of 80–90%, suddenly their income was reduced to $200 instead of $2,000, $400. So they couldn't live with, in addition to, when prices also went up, doubled, tripled, quadrupled in sometimes at the same time.
Desmond Thorpe asked, and I think this is for you, Rana, apart from remittances, where does the money come from? What does Lebanon export? I mean, how does it get foreign currency except from remittances?
This is an embarrassing question because
well, it's an answer that's embarrassing, not the question.
Embarrassing in the sense that Lebanon does not produce much that is tangible. And this is the problem, and the commercial banking sector has come under great criticism for providing loans and engaging in short-term speculation because they're risk averse at the expense of investing in a more productive economic sectors like agriculture, industry, etc. So there was a massive lopsided distribution, if you will, of loans. Where are the bank loans going, into which industry? That's not to exclude them, because they did. I mean, in all fairness, the commercial banks did provide loans to the agricultural sector, industrial sector, but not at the rate that they should have. And they did also engage in this kind of speculation. And sorry, again, 50% of the commercial bank portfolio was subsidizing the government loans. Okay, so that's an extremely inefficient way of investing your money, especially towards the end. And this is again a reason for the crisis, where the government was going to default on its loans. And so who's going to bear the brunt of that? It's the domestic commercial banks that overly invested in the Lebanese government who turned out to be not such a great client.
Wow. Hrair, this is from Fayed Abu Akel, and I apologize for mispronouncing his name, but he says, Lebanon is full of refugees, Palestinians, Syrians, Iraqis. How does, I mean, they're not part of what you're describing. I mean, they're not part of the traditional ethnic and faith communities within Lebanon. Are they sitting on the sides? Are they? How does that impact the political situation in Lebanon?
Indeed, that's a very good question. Lebanon has a population of approximately 5 million people, though there is no statistics, there's no census in Lebanon. So the numbers are always very, very speculative when we talk about the general population number and the division among the various sects. There's no reliable statistics, but it does host the largest proportion of refugees in the world. 1.5 million Syrian refugees have been in Lebanon now for 10 years or around 10 years. And historically, there were also 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon since 1948. But those numbers have been reduced dramatically. I think there aren't more than 200,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. This number of refugees in a country of the size and the size of population has obviously overstretched the resources of the country. Let's mention just one example: the educational resources. Many of the public schools in Lebanon are forced to have 2 or even 3 shifts in a day of students coming in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, because they don't have the space to accommodate the number of students that need to come to that school from the neighborhood. The water system has been stretched. The power system has been stretched, in addition to the inefficiencies of the whole power infrastructure. There's another thing too. It has had an impact on the politics of the country, because there is a fear that these refugees are there to stay. In other words, are in Lebanon to stay in Lebanon forever, just like the Palestinians have stayed since 1948. We're talking about the Syrian refugees. And the majority of the Syrian refugees are Sunni Muslims. So what happens? The Shia and the Christians are concerned that if this 1.5 million or thereabouts Syrian refugees stay in Lebanon forever, become permanent residents and eventually citizens, then the number of Sunnis in the country would be increased exponentially. Sure. And then that has an impact on the power sharing agreements, the resources, the economic and political resources of the country, etc. So it has a political impact as well.
Point of information, are refugees in camps, or they're spread out among the general population in apartments and housing everywhere?
Officially, there are no camps in Lebanon, refugee camps in Lebanon. But when you drive around Lebanon in the countryside, you see worse than camp situations on the sides of the road, on the field, agricultural fields, in abandoned buildings, in buildings not designed for housing, in schools sometimes. And there is a class of refugees who are middle class and live very comfortably in Beirut or in other cities or even villages in the countryside, in nice apartments, etc. Yeah.
Okay.
And can I add one thing though, to at least the Palestinian refugee camps throughout the decades of waves of influx, those areas, the Lebanese government does not have control over them. There's an agreement where the Lebanese army, the Lebanese authority does not extend to those areas. So there are these pockets that provide safe haven for, you name it, criminal activity,
violent extremists.
So Lebanese police can't go in there to investigate?
No, not allowed.
No.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So Rana, let me ask you this, because 3 or 4 people have asked the same question. What role are outside forces playing? Israel, Turkey, Syria, Iran. What role are outside forces playing in this civil war?
The civil war or today?
Today.
What-
Okay, today.
Yeah, well,
There's this quasi approaching, getting closer to a civil war. Okay.
yeah. So the regional dynamics, and like Hrair explained earlier, the power system is full of fissures, which are very easy to exploit. And so everyone needs an external backer. That's not to say that the external backers are not also happy to comply and fight out their fights inside Lebanon. But to put this in a broader context, there is a regional tension between, to put it very bluntly, even though there are nuances, like Iranians trying to curb American influence, US influence in the region, and vice versa. And so they have patrons. And so Hezbollah is supported by Iran. And then you have the Future movement, on the other side, tend to be supported by the West. And so this is a bit of a game beyond good and evil, whereas people come in and fight over influence in Lebanon through these parties. And so, I mean, it's definitely a weakness that so many external players are involved, but it also could be a strength, because look at today, Lebanon is suffering from a financial crisis and actually makes headlines, whereas other places do not. For example, neighboring Syria is also going through a pretty severe financial and macroeconomic crisis, and somehow Lebanon, has more of a spotlight. And I think it's because it's a terrain where a lot of these tensions easily play, and many actors are involved. Hrair, I don't know if you'd like to add to that.
No, I think you've explained that. Yeah.
Okay, so Byron Stokes asks, I mean, the French feel they have a historic role in Lebanon as the former colonial power. Byron Stokes asks, what happened to President Macron's grand strategy and his attempts at reform in Lebanon? And I'll let you guys figure out who should answer that.
You would think that the Lebanese would be wise enough to respond positively to Macron's interests of helping the country. And it's not just Macron, others in the international community, the European Union, even the US have offered help to Lebanon, but in exchange, not in exchange, but on the condition that the Lebanon would clean up its corruption before that assistance comes into Lebanon. And the assistance is more than just humanitarian assistance that has been promised and designed for the country. But the Lebanese politicians have failed to adopt the most basic economic and judicial reforms to create the conditions in the country to receive such large amounts of money, largesse, from the international community to help its economy. They have failed to enact the reforms necessary to do that. So the whole idea of Macron's assistance and other members of the international community, in particular the European Union's assistance, have been waiting for these reforms to become reality. And we still have to see that become reality.
Sela Misirian, and she gets a question because she says she's an Armenian Lebanese. Her father's name is Hrair, and so she sent a big greeting to you, Hrair. And she asked what a number of people have asked is, what's the solution? How do you get out of this? Lebanon appears to have painted itself into a corner. How do you get out of this?
That's a question that all of us with Lebanese background, and those of us interested in conflict resolution put to ourselves, at least I do, on a daily basis, every single day. I wonder, where is the solution? One side of my brain says the solution has to come from outside because the Lebanese have proven themselves incapable of coming up with the solution. But that also has its impediments, its problems. Solutions imposed from outside usually are perhaps even more problematic than the problem they're trying to solve. It has to be a combination of the international community, not just the East or the West, but a combined international community coming together to convince, to force basically the politicians in Lebanon to change their way of doing business. Easier said than done, I admit it. But also has to be the pressure from below, the civil society that Rana described earlier, this emerging new civil society in Lebanon, which are very active. They've done a marvelous job in basically filling in the void from the state to rebuild the parts of Beirut that have been destroyed by the explosion in the summer of 2020, and have been trying to protest and demonstrate and force the politicians to. So it has to be a combination of the civil society, grassroots movement from the bottom up, as well as from the top down, to force the politicians to do what they have refused to do so far. Again, I admit this is easier said than done, but there is no other solution.
Can I add something to Hrair's point, which I 100% agree with? But what I did also want to add is, I think Lebanon has suffered from this specific problem for a long time, but over the past 2 years is suffering deeply from financial, health, energy crisis, etc. So I think there's also an opportunity to stop the bleeding immediately, because there's like immediate needs, and then there's reforms that need to happen on the time continuum. But as a first step, stopping the bleeding is crucial, and I think there is room for the international community to influence that, because the Lebanese government has lost its lender of last resort, which is its domestic commercial banks, and they're in a real corner for a bailout. And they're in current negotiations with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, etc., for basically funds to fund fiscal spending, government spending. And so there is an opportunity, there is a lever that could potentially be used by the international community to force these necessary reforms on the government, namely in terms of transparency, accountability, good governance, starting in very technical areas like the energy sector, etc. So that's one lever that exists today that did not exist prior because of the terrible situation that we're in.
There's one thing that needs to be done, and that can be a game changer. The international community has to force the Lebanese authorities, in particular the banking authorities, to publish all the funds that have been transferred out of Lebanon when no ordinary Lebanese could have even cashed their bank accounts or transfer any part of their bank accounts abroad. But the elite in Lebanon have been able to transfer $37 billion out of the country's banking system. $37 billion between middle of 2019 to the end of 2020. In a year and a half time, $37 billion have been transferred out of the country. Who had that money? How were they able to transmit? If that is published, I think you will see the large majority of politicians implicated in that scheme. And hopefully the Lebanese voters in the next elections in March 2022 would keep that in mind as to who were the ones who were able to, first of all, steal the money from the country, and secondly, transfer that money out into offshore accounts so that they can flee the country and benefit and not elect them in 2022, March 27th elections, parliamentary elections.
That's a tall order. So let's go back to the Carter Center. Both of you do conflict resolution. Is there a role for the Carter Center? Have you been asked to work in Lebanon? How do you stack this up? I mean, you specialize in hopeless situations when you specialize in conflict resolution. How does this hopeless situation compare to the other extremely difficult situations where the Carter Center has worked?
I don't like to compare situations. This is indeed a very difficult situation in need of not an intervention, but in need of ideas on how to begin with, at the very least, ideas on how one can address this Lebanese conundrum, which has been for decades in the making. We are looking into that, but we haven't come to any conclusion yet as to what, if anything, can be done, or what, if anything, the Carter Center can do in this situation.
Rana, I'm going to give you the last word. What's the solution? What would you like to see?
Look, it's a very hard question. And again, think I'm blinded by immediate needs at this point. Like I'm saying, I do dream, like Martin Luther King, of one day, where my child, not to bore you with details, but I'm in Lebanon. If they always ask you, are you Christian or are you Muslim? If you answer that you're an atheist, well, are you a Christian atheist or a Muslim atheist? There's no such thing. But like, I dreamed that one day I'm Protestant, that my child, could decide to run for anything they want and be part of a meritocracy and nothing else, right? That where hard work pays off, and unfortunately, Lebanon is not such a place. So that's my big dream for the future. And my small dream is immediate relief. Like we said, on the energy, medicine, on the very basic survival level.
So I've got to thank you both. This has been extraordinary. We've been talking for 50 minutes and it seems like 15 minutes. I want to thank you, Rana. Thank you, Hrair. I share your hope that one day people will be able to prosper, do well, that Lebanese will be able to live as well in Lebanon as they do in the Lebanese diaspora around the world. I mean, that's so basic for every country. You shouldn't have to immigrate in order to feel safe, in order to pursue a career, in order to thrive. So thank you both so much. I've learned so much today. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank Paige Alexander and the Carter Center for agreeing to a joint program with the World Affairs Council. I now need to turn to a little bit of self-promotion. Next Thursday, a week from tomorrow, November 4th, we have a live program at 6 p.m. at the Commerce Club downtown with Nelson Forster, who is the ambassador of Brazil to the US. I got a note here, Brazil, the country that actually has more Lebanese living in it than live in Lebanon. So this is a great place to come talk about Brazil and to talk about Lebanon, I suppose. The title of the conversation is going to be 5 Things You Need to Know About Brazil, live and in person. Please register now. It's a reception followed by a conversation like this. It's going to be great. Then on Saturday, November 6th in the morning from 9:30 a.m. to 12:30 in the afternoon, we have our World Affairs Council Young Leaders Conference. The topic is transportation, infrastructure, and resiliency to climate change. It's organized by our young leaders at the World Affairs Council, but the audience is not supposed to be young leaders. It's open to everybody, so please join us. I want to give a special thanks to Hina Rennie, who's our program director and is the producer of this program today, to Laura Brower and Anna Petrova, Petrova, and to our interns, Riti Sarangi and Amiel Forbes. It's been extraordinary. Once again, thank you, Rana. Thank you, Hrair, for joining us and for agreeing to do it. It's on such short notice.
Good job.
This has been great. We've learned a lot. Yeah, any closing words for the audience? No. Okay, just smile. So thank you both. This is great. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Charles and Hrair. Thank you.
Yeah. Y'all have a great afternoon. Everybody, thank you for joining us. And I hope to see you next Thursday at the Commerce Club, live and in person with the Ambassador of Brazil to the United States. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.